Same old man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger potion.
Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for November 22nd, 2023, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation. We hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving as we continue on with award season.
Oh,
Things are
busy.
Getting
Too
very
much.
busy.
Too much. It's like
Absolutely.
Hollywood's now saying we have all this great content. Critics,
I know.
get busy.
Exactly. I mean, this last week alone, we had a review for The Hunger Games. Recently, we just had a review go out for Alexander Payne's The Holdovers. Of course, we're doing Rustin here. And then fairly soon, we're going to do the Todd Haynes film, May, December. Maestro is coming out very soon. What else? We got The Boy and the Heron on the horizon as well.
Poor Things,
Poor
Saltburn.
Yeah. All the Strangers.
Oh my gosh, American
So much to
Fiction.
talk about. Yeah.
We're
getting
we're
crazy.
just scratching the surface. We're only talking about the cherry on top. We haven't even gotten to the cake yet.
Exactly. There's so much to talk about. And of course, Rustin hit Netflix a week ago, so we are getting to this a little bit late, but it's been very busy, as
It has been,
we just
yeah.
noted. But we do want to talk about it because Colman Domingo is getting all kinds of love and praise for his
He is.
performance in this
He is.
film. And I do think it is worth talking about. Before we get to it, though, Brendan, did you have any, I guess, preconceived notions for this film? What did you think about it going into it?
No real preconceived notions other than it being another film from director George C. Wolfe, if I'm not mistaken, whose last film was Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which was, again, a really great performative piece. I didn't fully love the movie, but I loved it as a performative piece. So at the very least, I was expecting a film that felt very performative, whether it be from its main lead performance of Colman Domingo or from its overall ensemble. We do get that, I'll simply say. So that's at least what I expected, being a very good center for a great actor.
For sure. I think what's interesting about Rustin, obviously it was going to be a showcase for Colman Domingo, and I'm excited to talk about his performance, but the film, despite execution, we'll certainly talk about it, but this is a movie that's also shining a light on a man that I think is largely forgotten in history and in the textbooks. This gay black man who was vital to the March on Washington. I don't know if that's a name people are familiar with.
No, a forgotten hero of sorts.
And I'd say that in the context of you and I grew up in an era where there was certainly an agenda with the textbooks, but now more so there's legislation that's trying to erase these kinds of stories, at least in the state that I live in. So it does, I think, give weight to this movie, regardless of how we feel about its execution. I do think highlighting the man and telling his story is noteworthy.
It is, yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, that's more or less why Barack and Michelle Obama wanted this movie to get made. Because they wanted to highlight those forgotten heroes in history. Because when we see this story and we hear about this story, our mind automatically goes to Martin Luther King Jr. And in many ways, rightfully so. And King is a part of this movie as a character, a main character of sorts in this movie. His presence is overarching. So that is very deliberate, but that is also the historical name everyone associates with this march. And I get it, but as someone that was King's advisor for much of this, like that's a very crucial role that we sometimes don't think about.
Exactly, because we think about the speech and the impact that had, but there had to be someone organizing that event. There had to be a way for people to get there.
Yeah.
So if you're a process person, oh my goodness, buckle up. You are going to eat while watching this. All right, let's get into it. So it is directed by George C. Wolfe, as Brennan noted. It, of course, stars Colman Domingo, as well as Emil Amin, Chris Rock, Jeffrey Wright, among many others that come and go throughout the film, including Divine Joy Randolph, who we just talked about.
In the Holdovers, making a brief appearance as Mahala Jackson, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, so just had to throw that out there. She's getting all kinds of lovely roles this year.
What a great actress, and also what a great singer.
Yes,
that one moment. It's not even a scene. It's just it's more of a cameo in this movie.
It is,
but yeah, it's a powerful one. It's a powerful one. Coming off the heels of the Holdovers, the timing's perfect.
Absolutely. If you're not familiar with Rustin, it is, of course, about activist Bayard Rustin, who faces racism and homophobia as he helps change the course of civil rights history by orchestrating the 1963 March on Washington. All right, Brendan, we laid out the groundwork of this film and why it is important. But tell me, as a movie, what did you think of Rustin?
Well, it is hard. And again, this is maybe part of the problem with the way history has arguably erased people like Bayard Rustin, right? Because when watching this movie, you automatically maybe think of a movie like Ava DuVernay's Selma, right? And part of the reason why you think about that is not just because of the Martin Luther King Jr. of it all, but the fact that Colman Domingo is also in Selma. The person of Bayard Rustin is also in Selma. It's not played by Colman Domingo. So
wouldn't that have been some incredible irony?
Oh, imagine if we got David Oyelowo back to play Martin Luther King Jr. And if this would have been like literally maybe not a sequel. I guess the word would be a spinoff, right?
Spinoff,
yeah. Like that would have been kind of interesting. Yeah. I mean, but in a way, at the same time, I'm glad it doesn't do that, because that would have maybe masked the overall point of this movie, because then you're automatically going back to then all of a sudden you're going back to thinking about Martin Luther King Jr. and not Bayard Rustin, right?
Yes.
So it kind of defeats the whole point of this movie existing.
Even though he is important to this movie.
He is very important. Yeah. We mentioned this earlier. Martin Luther King Jr. is, I hate to use the word character because that implies that they're not real people, but you kind of have to use that term in the way that they function within the narrative. They're characters in this particular story.
Yes.
And the way that King is utilized, he is kind of a not really a main character, but he's a very crucial side character. He's in the movie a lot. Emil Amin as King is in the movie for quite a bit of time. So like that shadow is very much present, and I think the movie is trying to do that. I do think that is its point, but if anything, this really does feel like a vehicle for Colman Domingo. So the hype around his performance, will it end up in my 5 favorite lead performances of the year as far as the male acting category is concerned? It's too soon to tell, but if he does, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised. I do think he is genuinely great here. And the movie really does revolve around his presence. Like, it almost feels like the movie was written and directed with him specifically in mind. So when it's really just him, just verbalizing anything, there was a lot of care and attention going into how Rustin himself was going to be portrayed. It's another way of me saying I think the movie itself is, I think it's fine. I think the movie itself is fine. If anything, it is kind of sloppy as a narrative, the way it's trying to tie multiple aspects together of not just Rustin's impact on social justice, but also homophobia of this time as well. I do think both of these extremes are crucial to this man's life as well as this story, but they oftentimes feel like two disconnected movies, the way they're put together. And I did feel that quite a bit as far as how each of these interlocking aspects of history are meant to tie together, because I don't think they seamlessly tie together as a final product. The film in totality, I think, doesn't fully work. But I think the performance absolutely works. So if there is anything to argue about this movie being worth seeing, it's the Colman Domingo of it all. I do think he is quite great here, even if the movie itself perhaps underserves the historical aspect a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like we're in a very similar camp here. I did like the movie overall, primarily because of Colman Domingo, excuse me, and he is extraordinary here.
Yeah.
He brings a vibrancy, a conviction to the character that is electric. And I think because of that performance and how he is able to elaborate on those convictions in this way that strikes you because of the electricity he brings to it, when that is brought down and you see his humanity come out, I do think those moments are genuinely poignant, and it very much speaks to Domingo's performance in that regard. I do agree with you, though, on the whole, it leaves a little bit to be desired, but I think what's so frustrating to me, as much as I do find this to be one of the more vital biopics that we've seen in recent years because of what we mentioned earlier. This is a guy that not many people will know about if you're unfamiliar with him, as I was. And again, I didn't grow up in a state like Florida where they're actively trying to undermine these stories. And I still wasn't all that aware of him. So this is the reason biopics exist, to tell these kind of stories and highlight people that you might not know about. However, as a movie, it's interesting to me how this film fails itself twice in the sense that it does the thing that I think most biopics should do, right? This isn't a new talking point in recent years, especially. I love that this film is not about Bayard Rustin's entire life. This is a slice of life movie in some way. It's about a sliver of time in his life.
It owes a lot to Selma. I know we brought that comparison up earlier, but that in
really
many ways,
does.
it's kind of the blueprint for this movie. It's very much the inspiration.
Very much Selma, although I don't think that it reaches the heights of Selma.
Agreed.
And I think the major factor there is that this film just gets a little bit too broad. And it isn't able to delve into the same kind of nuances that I do think Selma does, even though Selma gets a little broad as well. But I think it's able to have its cake and eat it too a lot more. I do appreciate the sliver of time approach. That was the right call.
I agree.
However, it's still quite broad in how we're telling the life of Bayard Rustin in terms of how the NAACP, kicked him out, essentially. How it led to him organizing this march separately, how he had to eventually reunite with his friend Martin Luther King Jr., him dealing with life in the 60s as a gay black man and the struggles of that. There is a lot that defines Bayard Rustin. However, this film is only concerned with the broad strokes.
It is.
And it doesn't really delve into the depths of any of those things in a meaningful way. And I say that, I guess, hesitantly, because I do want to like this film. And in many ways, I do find it compelling. I guess my frustration just comes in that I think it's all a little superficial here. So it's such a... I guess it's just a little twofold for me. I do think it's good. It's important. Domingo is great. The film just is a little too broad in its storytelling strokes for it to resonate in a meaningful way, I guess, in the end.
It is very high level, and I could see the argument that doing it in such a superficial way allows the forgotten history to be more easily conveyed. But then the other side of that coin is don't you think a man like this deserves a little bit better?
Yeah.
And that's where I'm leaning more towards, because I would have liked to see something more complex in that regard. This definitely feels like a movie that maybe would have had more of a place if it came out, I don't know, 10 years ago or something like that. Maybe during the Trump era specifically. I think maybe something like this would have been more widely accepted given the messages of it. But I think we've moved past some of that a little bit now to allow something to be a bit more complex and be more invited to those things. I think the movie actually does start off really strong for me. I think the first maybe 10 to 15 minutes, I thought, wow, this is actually looking to be a very interesting movie, because you mentioned about Rustin himself basically being essentially let go from the NAACP, right? That dynamic he has with them is really fascinating, because it almost sets itself up to be black on black in this kind of situation, which I do think is a potentially interesting perspective to add to this to this historical struggle, almost as if the NAACP could have been the quote unquote antagonists of this story. And at times they kind of are, but there's at least a fascinating introduction to where maybe this story could have gone. And that's not me saying I think it should have. I'm not trying to say that this movie should have been something I wanted as opposed to what it needed to be. It's just an example of something that could have been more nuanced and complex, that would have been more welcoming to a story like this, without getting bogged down by the superficial details as it does.
No, I completely agree with that. And I think that's perhaps where, even though this is a sliver of time, it certainly would have benefited from getting even more narrow and emphasizing either the dichotomy of him being a black gay man at this time, how that, compounds upon his activist roles. And it being less about the process. I think that would have perhaps benefited, but this is also about him organizing the March on Washington. So maybe it's less on him personally and it's more about the process, because this is a fairly, lengthy film. I don't think this is over 2 hours, right?
No, it's an hour and 46 minutes as I look at the IMDb page. And, with credits, the credits are actually pretty long. It's maybe a 10-minute closing credit sequence as it plays that Lenny Kravitz song over top. So it's really an hour and a half long. It's a 90-minute movie.
Absolutely. And it's a mile a minute, and all of this narrative that it wants to tell where, it's not able to get into those complexities that you're talking about. So I do think getting maybe even more narrow really would have benefited this film at 90 minutes. And I will say, in a vacuum, I find all of those things fascinating, especially given Domingo's performance and how he's able to evoke those things. But, I joked earlier about those that like process are going to like this movie. I did find that, albeit on the surface, I did find it compelling how he had to organize, churches getting together. We had to go from town to town to raise money. We had to get transportation, and eventually everyone was going to sleep in these tents. It was going to be a 2-day, then it had to be a 1-way or 1 day. So you're dealing with all of the logistics of that and housing and everything that goes into it. This film does showcase Rustin leading the charge in that regard. Again, is it a little hollow? Yes. I think it could have done a little bit more there, because even as he's demonstrating all of these directives, we don't get into it as much as we probably could have. And it culminates in a moment where, again, he's on trial, as you're talking about, where it's one of the senators. It's the NAACP essentially putting him on display, on trial, so to speak, of, are you really the guy here? And he has his assistants essentially lay out, here's everything we've been doing. And it's just told to us, right?
It is.
We don't really see it. We see the hustle and bustle of his office, but that's as far as it goes. And I think there's a whole movie just in terms of organizing the logistics. And look, maybe that's mundane. Maybe that's not exciting enough as someone who enjoys
Yeah,
seeing the
this could have been
drama of
all the
how that
president's
unfolds.
men for Rustin.
Exactly. You think
Yeah.
about journalistic movies in that regard, and those are still very compelling. And this could have been that. Now, would it have been service to Rustin as a person? Probably not. I agree. It would have done him a little bit of a disservice. But as an activist, this is his crown jewel. He did a lot of
Yeah.
other great things, but he was essential in organizing the 1963 March on Washington, this pivotal moment, huge moment in American history that eventually led to legislative change. So emphasizing the logistics and his role in it, and in some of the pushback, not just from white senators, but also Adam Clayton Powell Jr., played by Jeffrey Wright, and as we noted, the NCAA, like he was getting it from all angles. So you don't have to leave those things out, but emphasizing the logistics while him dealing with those hurdles, I think, and making this film more narrow would have, I think, benefited this film on the whole. Or again, you just completely let the logistics linger in the background. We don't really get into it, and you just examine the man.
Yeah, and maybe with that, focus on the relationship that he forms with Elias Taylor, played by Johnny Ramey.
Yes.
Again, a performance I really like, but when there's equal focus on all things here, that's where they all come off as rather superficial. And
Yes.
it's just one of those cases that if you wanted to make a film in this way, a narrative film specifically, it maybe needed to pick a lane. And I too am with you. I did find the process angle, the mechanics of organizing this march to be rather fascinating. But when your most interesting thing is the mechanics, and that's really all you have to work with, then you as a filmmaker and storyteller, you have a lot of work to do to convince me that this didn't need to be a documentary. And but again, that's kind of twofold, because not many people are going to watch a documentary as much as a narrative film. So then does that also mean Bayard Rustin's story becomes even more forgotten then? So I get the visibility of making this as a narrative feature certainly makes more sense.
Especially with these stars, right? I mean, Colman Domingo might not be Chris Rock, but Chris Rock does have a supporting role here. And that's a big name.
So distracting in this movie, if I'm being honest.
Maybe, but he brings some star power here.
For sure.
Jeffrey Wright, I think, is a face that a lot of people are familiar with.
I think he's effective here. I like him in this.
He's very good. I do agree. So, in Colman Domingo, even if you don't know him, you're going to be absolutely energized by his performance.
Yeah.
He's really great. It truly is one of the best of the year. And despite where he sits on our list, if he's not nominated for an Oscar, I'm going to lose my mind. He's really great. Like this fits the bill of how the Oscars nominates for Best Actor.
Yep.
So he should absolutely be in. And you're right. I mean, if this is essentially going to be a substitute for the history textbooks, meaning that it's a documentary but not, I guess that can be okay. Like it will serve that purpose as an educational foothold, as something you can hand to your students, as here's a depiction of the life of Bayard Rustin. This is what he had to deal with, and you're not going to find this anywhere else. I think the film is certainly sufficient in that regard. It's just, as critics and I guess cinephiles, people that love art and movies, I do think as a movie, it just
I'm with you.
It's just a little too broad.
Well, even from a historical angle, I often wonder too, and I mentioned this earlier, that Martin Luther King Jr. does have a major presence here, right?
Yeah.
And again, I think that's another aspect here that might be a little bit twofold, because on one hand, I know he needs to be here, not just for historical reasons, but to emphasize the importance of someone that wasn't Martin Luther King Jr., right? But by having such a notable historical figure here all the time, well, not all the time, but for a good chunk of time, does that then undermine the titular character simultaneously, especially when some of these other aspects are still very high level, as we're saying? And I did wonder about that too, and maybe it's just simply because I didn't really love Emil Amin's performance as Martin Luther King Jr. I think he's fine here. But again, I think this is another aspect of the movie just finding itself lost under Selma's shadow. I was constantly, and that might be more on me. I'm constantly thinking about David Oyelowo's performance in that movie then.
Yeah, and I do think that's a performance that needs to be more robust because he's the central figure there, and you're delving into the complexities of his life, him at home, him as a preacher, him as an activist and a public figure, and you're getting all of those aspects. So the performance needs to depict the humanity that goes into every one of those avenues.
Sure.
Martin Luther King Jr. in this movie is not that. Not to that degree anyway. Sure, you get a little bit of the public persona, and Amin is able to deliver that adequately enough, but mostly we get the man behind the scenes and the friend of Rustin. And I think by keeping his performance, I hate to phrase it this way, but I mean it as a positive, to make it a little bit more subdued, I think is appropriate because, one, again, he's not on camera all that often. He's talking to his friends. He's talking to the NAACP. He's trying to get this thing organized alongside Rustin. And also, dramatically, and maybe this is myopic of me, but I think having a subdued performance and letting Domingo and his electricity carry the heft of this film, I think is the right move, because then it does subvert what is essentially a powerful character, someone that everyone will know, and he becomes less of a factor because Domingo is clearly the magnetism that draws you into this film. So I do think it's effective in that regard. And to your point about, or I guess your question rather, as far as his inclusion here, I do think he has to be here because they were, for all intents and purposes, best friends, or at least very, very close friends, and worked very closely on this specific campaign.
Yeah.
So I think you do a disservice to the overall history to leave him out of this. But I think the film does a great job of not allowing him to take over. Like, there's large chunks here where he's just out of the movie altogether.
Maybe that's the thing, because I feel like I sensed him in this movie more than maybe you did. Even when he's not on screen, I always felt the king of it all.
They do reference him a lot.
Yeah,
they do talk about him.
They do. And again, it's twofold, because I know
they would, though, right?
I know they would. Yeah, and it's twofold, because I know Martin Luther King Jr. needs to be involved here, not just because of the importance of that man as we know him from a historical standpoint, but in a way to almost use him ironically, I guess, if that's the word, to emphasize the importance of someone that wasn't him. I guess maybe the reason why I find myself a little unsure about the utilization of King here is I didn't really buy into the friendship between him and Rustin. And again, maybe that's just a performance thing. Like, even when they were on screen, I felt like it was still just about the process. And I was still trying to find maybe that kinship that the film is suggesting was there, and we know was ultimately there, historically speaking. But I didn't always sense it, because it still felt like it was more about the mechanics of what they were doing as opposed to who they were as friends.
Yeah, no, I don't think you're wrong there. I think it is like that relationship does become a victim of the film's overall comprehensiveness, because early on there is conflict between them, right?
Yeah.
He's the reason, or part of the reason, that Rustin has to hand in his resignation to the NAACP.
It kind of starts off like Martin Luther King Jr. is the bad guy in some ways.
Well, a little bit. Like, he plays
I'm
a
using
role.
that term like facetiously, but he's definitely more. There's more confrontation between them as the film opens.
Absolutely, which is obviously purposeful, because there comes a moment when his mother, I'm trying to remember the character, but she essentially tells him that you need to go get your friend. You cannot do this without Martin Luther King Jr. He is your friend. You need to go win him back, which is, a powerful moment, not just because it's Martin Luther King Jr., but any time that there's a conflict between two people who are very close, and you want to bridge that gap, there's going to be, human tendencies at play.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
I think the film taps into that in a great way. But to your point, half of this movie then is that bridge between them.
Yeah.
So we never really see them as close friends like we likely would have if this was, let's say, about his life 5 years prior to these events, where they would have been with each other all of the time and they would have been hanging out, and you would have seen, because there's a moment early on where he talks about how Martin Luther King Jr.'s kids call him Uncle Bayard.
Yeah, that's true.
We don't we're just
it's hard to
told that
believe that.
initially.
Yeah.
So if we were to see that, in his life prior to the events of 1963, then maybe that would have brought more credence to that. Now, eventually we do see that a little bit because, again, of the moment where his mom tells him, you need to go get your friend. And so they go and so they start to have this reconnection, and he shows up at Martin Luther King Jr.'s house, and he's hanging out with his wife and their kids. And so you see the camaraderie. They clearly know him and they clearly love him. And so even though the film just tells us all these things early on, it does eventually show us. But by the time those two characters are starting to bridge that gap as friends again, we're halfway through this movie.
Yeah.
And so then the rest of it, because of its comprehensiveness and broad strokes,
and there's too much process to get through
the
still.
mechanics. So I think the performances do enough of a job. I especially think of that moment that seems quite iconic to this now, that moment of him standing in front of the TV responding to the speech that he gives on TV, that Martin Luther King Jr. gives on TV about them being friends. I mean, clearly that's mostly Domingo doing the work there and carrying the weight of it, but it is extremely effective because he's that great.
Colman Domingo might as well also be credited as a screenwriter here because
for real.
Yeah.
So it's hard as a storyteller, I think, to get that right because there's so much story to tell. By the time they reconnect, you're halfway through the movie, but we also have all these logistics and the process of getting to Washington. We got to get to. We got to put Rustin on trial with the NCAAP and Powell Jr. and all of these other things we've talked about. Not to mention just the racism or the hurdles he had the hurdles he had to overcome from Washington, which we see a few times as well. So the film can't devote enough time to demonstrating how close they were. We just have to, they tell us, we have to believe it or you don't. That's kind of it. So I think the performances sell it enough, but I do agree with you dramatically, writing wise, the film doesn't really earn it.
And I hate to say this because I think all aspects of this movie are important in their own way. But given the movie that this feels like it's trying to be, where its primary focus seems to be, I feel like what would have been more effective for this specific product was to replace the relationship between Rustin and Elias Taylor with that friendship you're talking about with him and King. And again, I understand how crucial Bayard's Rustin's history was as a gay man. We can't forget that. But if there is one thing this movie perhaps could have nixed, if anything at all, it is that romantic connection.
Yeah.
I think, and the thing is, it's not bad. It's just, I think it's the one thing that most underserves the movie, if that makes sense.
I agree, especially because you couple that with his other romantic interest. I forget the character's name.
Tom, played by Gus Halpern.
Yeah. Tom, who is a volunteer that works for Rustin, and we do see them romantically in a way early on, and then Tom makes it clear that because Rustin isn't committed, he just needs to keep that relationship professional. But throughout the film, especially given what happens between Rustin and Elias Taylor, things eventually pick up with Tom, and they explore that further. So Yeah, I mean, again, that side of Rustin is interesting. I agree. I think
Yeah.
it is compelling to see how that was a part of his life. It's certainly a defining trait.
Yeah.
And, again, does it feel disingenuous to leave that out? Maybe. But
Yeah.
when you're talking about a 90-minute movie, especially given the broad strokes here, if something needs to be removed to emphasize what this movie is as a movie about organizing this march,
Hmm.
that would have given more time for the film to develop those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I'm with
especially
you.
that relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. But because it wants to have its cake and eat it too, nothing here feels fully realized, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a missed opportunity. I feel like we're using a lot of words to come to that conclusion that it's a great story that needs to be told. I think the movie is worth seeing simply because of that forgotten historical aspect and the Colman Domingo of it all.
Yeah.
But it is still a missed opportunity of a film. It's a film that I would probably still give only it'd be no more than a 3 out of 5 on Letterboxd, maybe even a 2.5 out of 5 as far as how it functions as
that's
a
about where
movie.
I'm at. Yeah.
Yeah, but weirdly, I think it's at least necessary to know this story. It's hard to say it's necessary to see this movie, but it's necessary for those to know this story. And
Yeah.
I at least appreciate the film for wanting to tap into something that hasn't been told before.
Yep. Completely agree. The jazzy score from Brantford Marsalis.
That's at
is
least pretty
really
good. There are at least some, not even just with the score, but there are at least some directorial touches from George C. Wolfe that I did like. So actually, some of the flashback sequences in black and white are pretty effective. I think they do exude a sense of paranoia, especially from Rustin's perspective.
Yeah.
So I think those are pretty effective as well. And the way that jazzy score complements it gives it sort of a cacophonous energy, a frightful energy that I did appreciate as well. Although at the same time, while I did like touches of the direction and overall aesthetics here, those scenes on the steps outside the Lincoln Memorial, oh, that is some of the worst green screen I think I've seen in years. That is inexcusably bad.
Yeah. I don't disagree. I mean, the cinematography overall is drab.
It is,
and leaves a lot to be desired. It is the Netflix sheen that we've talked about forever.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's changing anytime soon.
It's our generation's made-for-TV movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Which is what makes something like The Killer just incredible. Like all the more incredible. Or Roma. Like those films were clearly not shot for Netflix.
There's a difference between a Netflix movie and movies made for Netflix. And, and I feel like this is more the former.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So the cinematography here is tepid at best. I do like the score. The green screen work isn't very good. I agree. I guess in some ways I do appreciate that all they show us is the ending of that speech. Without having to go through its most iconic moments, I guess.
Yes. Yeah.
Perhaps that would have been a little distracting because, again, it's not about Martin Luther King Jr. And I think by going through the more iconic moments or showing the whole speech, it would have become about that and not Rustin.
Yeah.
Although I think you can make the argument that without Rustin's efforts, we don't even get to that speech.
True.
So I guess I could understand it both ways. I think they handled that mostly very well.
I think just narratively and emotionally speaking, the final maybe 10 minutes are actually pretty good.
Yeah.
Not just in the limitation of the I Have a Dream speech, as you're saying, but there's a choice that Bayard Rustin makes as far as how he sees himself. Yeah, it involves collecting trash, I'll simply say. That I actually thought was a pretty nice touch.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that was good.
I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah. So on the whole, I don't love it, but I do think it's effective as a work of education, I guess.
Yeah.
As getting this story out there, allowing people to become aware of Bayard Rustin's narrative, and of course, as a showcase for Colman Domingo, who should at the very least be nominated for an Oscar.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. Yeah, he's really good here. It's been good for so long.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
I still think his best performance. What was that movie? Zola? Was that what it was called?
Yeah, you like that much more than I do.
He's very effective.
But he is
in
good
that.
in that.
Yeah,
I agree. I do think he's at least very good there.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's great. I think he's going to earn an Oscar for this film, hopefully,
or at least a
And he's
nomination.
So he's also showing up in The Color Purple. So I
Oh
know
yeah, he's
in
gonna.
that as
Okay,
well.
well, so that's gonna fuel the narrative. Then he's gonna have a year.
That's gonna fuel the narrative. So
I'm
he's
hearing
about
really
to have
good
one
things about
heck
that.
of a fall season. Yeah.
Yeah. Looking forward to that.
But his most important work of the year, of course, is his work as Unicron in Transformers: Rise of the Beast.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So
Sure.
just
Whatever.
throwing that out there.
I say whatever. I haven't even seen that movie yet, so I cannot judge.
It's fine. No, like as Unicron is significant to the movie, but not performatively, if that makes sense.
No, it
Mostly
makes sense.
plot-wise.
It's a Transformers movie. He's
It's a
functioning.
Transformers movie.
He's functioning
look,
for that
he's
movie.
fine. But he's had a big year, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Big,
That's
big
good.
year.
That's good. Yeah.
Will
Then
culminate
he'll-
in an Oscar nomination.
yeah, that'll be a way to honor him.
Culminate in an
Oh,
Oscar
I see what you did there.
nomination.
Yeah, nice pun work. I think that's a way to crystallize this conversation right here. We've just
Yeah,
we've crossed the finish line with that one.
Exactly. At any rate, if let us know if you agree or disagree with our thoughts here. Email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. Hit us up on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can leave a comment below if you're watching this on YouTube. Be sure to leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, all that fun stuff.
Yeah.
If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a review there as well. Brendan, any thoughts before we get out of here?
Hopefully everyone had a great Thanksgiving as we're releasing this after Thanksgiving. So, GD, white meat or dark meat? What was your preference?
Oh, I'm white meat all the way.
Oh, good man. Good man. That was a test and you passed. White meat all the way
Thank
for
you,
me
yeah.
as well.
Yeah, I love me some white turkey, mashed potatoes and gravy.
So good. So good.
And they're like my mother-in-law makes a really mean corn casserole that I love.
It's
It's
we
really
shouldn't
good.
talk about this now. You got to go back and relive that now.
What pie are you? Are you a pie guy?
It really depends. I do like pumpkin pie.
Pumpkin's great.
Pumpkin pie with with a little bit of whipped cream is kind of my
Yeah.
thing. But as I've gotten older, I've become a bit more prone to fruit-based pies. I do love apple pie as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's my jam.
That's your jam. Okay.
Apple is my jam every day.
Yeah. It really goes back and forth. I guess in many ways it sort of depends on how much I ate for Thanksgiving and what what I was
true.
really craving
Yeah.
at that time. If I've already intaked or took in too much sodium, I'll probably go to something a little less sweet
Yeah.
to close things off. So
For sure.
it really depends.
No, that's very fair. Yeah, that's why I do dessert beforehand.
I don't,
Make sure
I,
get
I don't know
mine
if
in.
that's smart. I don't know if that's smart.
No, usually I will eat dessert afterwards, but
Yeah.
I will usually eat dessert the next day most of the time.
Okay,
Because
okay.
I eat too much food. I'm there for the food.
Well, see,
I'm not
me
there
too.
for
That's the
dessert.
thing. Like, I've never been much of a dessert guy. I'm the kind of person that we're getting a little sidetracked here, but I think it's a fun conversation to have. I'm the kind of person that if you were to give me a plate of like ice cream, the best ice cream in the world, and then a plate of strawberries, I would pick the strawberries for my dessert. Like that's just my palate craves that kind of sweetness more. That's just always been my thing.
No, that's understandable. That's my son Sam.
Oh,
That's
really?
him.
That's
Yeah.
good to have that at an early age.
He eats strawberries like it's his job.
Oh, it's so good.
What he
It's
consumes. He's
it's-
obsessed.
It's among my top 10 favorite foods. Like I love them that much.
No, that's very fair. No, I definitely get it. I mean, generally speaking, I'm like a meat and potatoes guy.
Yep,
like
same.
my father's that way. So
Yeah.
I'm there for the food,
You
the
like
main
your
course, if
protein.
you will. Yeah.
Yeah, same
so
here.
give me that, and if there's room for dessert, great. If not, that's okay too. That's kind of
yep.
where I stand on that.
I'm
So,
with you. Minds think alike. We should have Thanksgiving together sometime.
yeah, we should.
We really
definitely
should,
make
yeah.
that happen.
Yeah.
All right. With all of that said, we hope everyone had a great holiday. Looking forward to the rest of award season. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. They better nominate Colman Domingo.
I think
I'm
he's
gonna
in.
be upset if they don't.
He's got it. He's got it. Nothing to worry about.